Professor Cheeseman, welcome to the conversation.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Wonderful. How is the situation with the COVID-19 in England?
It's really bad. I'm calling you right now from Birmingham, where we have a spike and a bit of a local lockdown, and a lot of controversies and discussions about whether or not we should be teaching face-to-face because of the COVID risk and the risk that it will spread among students. So it's a really big issue right here.
Wonderful. Well, I'm very happy to have you for this conversation, in particular to discuss your book, your latest publication, Institutions and Democracy in Africa, How the Rules of the Game Shape Political Developments. I've been going through some reviews of this book, and I've noticed that it received quite some impressive and lofty praise from the academic community. Before I do have a couple of questions for you, but before we get to start to have the conversation about this, the content of this book, can you just tell us when you started to research this book, how you went about doing the research and soliciting for contributors?
Thanks so much. Yeah, actually, when you asked me to come on, I thought I'd have a look at some of the reviews, because sometimes I tend to avoid them in case they're critical and it will depress me and I won't be able to write anything ever again. And I had a look, and yeah, there's quite a few really nice reviews out there. So that's really nice that people have seen something in it. A lot of the credit for that, doesn't go to me. It goes to the brilliant contributors. This is an edited collection. An edited collection sometimes have a bit of a reputation for being uneven or inconsistent, but we have a set of brilliant contributors. I would say each of the chapters makes a real contribution, and all of them speaks to the same theme and uses a similar framework. So it's really coherent. And basically the project came together because a number of us, I think for a while, had been frustrated that there was a strand within African studies that basically treated the continent as if it was institutionless. The kind of idea that institutions never matter, that politics is all driven by simply personal connections and by perhaps cultural factors or historical traditional factors, and that institutions didn't really need to be taken seriously. And that, that's been a significant strand within African studies. It's been a significant strand, in the way that neo-patrimonialism has been interpreted by some people not to be the kind of creative interaction of formal institutions and sort of social norms, but for some people, the kind of social norms, the culture washing over the institutions like it's a kind of sandcastle built too close to the sea, so that the institutions have no purchase whatsoever. And I think in building the book and in interacting the contributors, what we came to realize was that a number of different people have been working on the importance of institutions from very different angles at the same time. So some people had been working on the fact that actually in many countries, for example, presidential term limits have been respected. And not only one president has respected them, but the second president has respected them, and so on. And so there seems to become an institutionalization of presidential term limits in some countries. In others, of course, they've been removed. Other people were looking at the question of, what was the long-term impact of the kind of legal frameworks codified during colonial rule? For example, communal landholding versus individual, or the forms of credit and access in the economy. And the authors of those chapters found that those kinds of early decisions had really important long-term consequences for how parts of the legal system and the economic system developed. And my own work, suggested, going back to the 1960s, that yes, in some ways, there were weak institutions, and presidents like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, or Kenyatta in Kenya, Kaunda in Zambia, etc., could, design political systems of their own design. But at the the same time, they were constrained in those choices by the kind of institutional inheritance from colonial rule, that leaders who inherited, for example, strong political parties were much more likely to want to rule through parties and invest in them. Leaders who inherited a very strong bureaucracy were more willing to invest in the civil service and more willing to allow the party to wither away. And so we came to realize it in very different ways from very different angles. We were all saying institutions matter, and they matter more than some of the literature has recognized. So the book is really a kind of call to arms. It's an argument that we need to think about African politics in a different way, that we need to think about institutions as being really important, not just informal institutions, social norms and personal networks, which we often talk about in African studies, but formal political institutions, constitutions, legislatures, presidential term limits, legal frameworks. But importantly, and I think this is the really key point to make so that people don't kind of get confused about what the book's really about. It's not arguing that institutions always matter, and it's not arguing that institutions always matter in a simplistic way. It's often saying that actually institutions have quite subtle effects that shape the way people behave, sometimes in ways that were not anticipated or expected by the people who design the institutions. So institutions don't necessarily shape the world exactly as you might expect them to, but they nonetheless have an impact. And if we don't take that impact seriously, then we basically misunderstand African politics.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm sure that people have, and our audience have gotten the central argument and the central theme of your book. So what factors and institutions would you consider to be the most central to the functioning of democracy in Africa, and how can they be designed and modified in such a way that they can achieve a collective purpose of advancing human rights, of advancing constitutionalism and democratic principles in Africa?
Well, there are certain institutions that are described in the book that turn out to be particularly significant, not just for their formal kind of obvious role, but also in other ways. So I mentioned before presidential term limits. We've got a great paper by two Daniels, Posner and Young, updating their earlier work on presidential term limits and looking at the conditions under which presidential term limits come to be respected. Now, not only is their chapter really interesting for that, but it also leads to a really interesting set of questions, which is, what happens when presidential term limits are respected versus when they are not? And one of the things that other researchers, for example, Michael Bratton, has found is that when presidential term limits are respected, that I found, when presidential term limits are respected, you get much more likely to get a transfer of power. Because when the ruling party needs to select a new presidential candidate, they often struggle to do so. And because they struggle to do so, they often split. You often find that the new candidate that's coming doesn't quite have that good a relationship sometimes with the existing candidate. There might be some tensions, and that can create windows of opportunity again for the opposition. And the new candidate might need to be, for example, in an ethnically divided society, might need to be from a different region than the old candidate. In Nigeria, for example, we have the idea of zoning. In other countries, the idea of kind of sharing power around different groups. And that means that the new candidate might not be able to take over wholesale the kind of patronage networks, clientelistic networks, individual networks, institutional networks of their predecessor. So presidential term limits actually create a significant opportunity for opposition parties to win power. And my work shows that the opposition goes from about a 10% chance of winning power to about a 50% chance of winning power, depending on whether they're contesting against a president who's sitting, or whether there's what we would call an open seat election. There's actually no president contesting because they've had to stand down because of presidential term limits. And that then has a really important impact on the second set of things, because we know that when presidents actually lose power, or governments lose power, when we see a transfer of power, and this is the Mike Braden research I was mentioning earlier, but I think Stefan Lindberg and Defra Moller have also done some work on this, that effectively when we see a transfer of power, we see a significant boost in public support for democracy. And we also, I think it's reasonable to hypothesize, would see an increase in the confidence of elite players in the country on the idea that we're actually going to have a kind of process of democratic consolidation. People start to believe in that process more once power has changed hands. So we can go from respect for presidential term limits to likelihood of opposition victories. We can go from the transfers of power onto support for democracy. So we can see there how enforcing and keeping an institution like presidential term limits can have this knock-on positive effect on democratization. Not always, of course. There are many examples of where we can see presidential term limits not leading to a transfer of power. There's also cases where transfers of power don't lead to a process of democratization. But in general, we can get a sense of how institutions can shape that process if they're respected. And I think there's a number of other ways in which we can do the same thing. I mean, in a different article that I've written, which looks at the question of, how do we design constitutions, and engages with the work of people like Alan Cooperman, I also suggest that as well as promoting that, as well as promoting transfers of power and institutionalization and term limits and the rotation of the presidency through different individuals, we probably also want to make sure that we're protecting, the position of minorities, and maybe making sure that people who lose elections don't necessarily lose too much. And so we might want to build, reasonably inclusive constitutions that encourage a sense that, those who lose out don't necessarily lose out, comprehensively. Kenya, for example, introduced devolution. And at least in the 2013 election, I think it's true that people who voted for Raila Odinga, who lost nationally, were often in counties where they were able to elect their own governor, and they were able to elect a governor from their party, from their own identity, which softened the blow of losing the presidential election. So the introduction of more inclusive systems on the one hand, that gives people a stake in the system and reduces the blow of losing power, combined with really strengthening and respecting key institutions like elections, term limits. That combination, I think, allows us to have both kind of political competition, so we get better government because governments are competing with each other and there's accountability, whilst also managing inclusion and hopefully not making people feel excluded from the system. And to me, that's probably the sweet spot if we want to try and build sustainable, democracies in countries where so far that's been really problematic.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. So now, with reference to typical examples, perhaps of case studies that we have examined, how has neo-patrimonial politics and electoral fraud affected the efficiency of the functioning of formal institutions of democracy?
Well, I think, neo-patrimonialism is, it's a slightly problematic term. One of the things that I do in the introduction of the book is I try and kind of critique the term. Because if we go back to the way that the term was initially used by figures like Medard, I think one of the first sort of really good book chapters on this was his in 1982. He told us that, there were two things that are happening at the same time. There's a kind of institutional format of the state that is trying to bed in and institutionalize. And there's these personal and clientelistic and ethnic ties that are connecting the president to different people and that are undermining the formal institutions working as you might want them to. And so you have these two different kind of forms of order or authority coexisting and in tension. And Medard says at the end of that article or that chapter, he says, don't assume that neo-patrimonialism is everywhere, and don't assume that all Africa is equally neo-patrimonial. He said this is a model that we can apply to see whether it fits, not something that we should assume. And I think one of the things that sort of happened since then is perhaps because, the 1980s saw a lot of sort of corruption and authoritarian politics, that people got used to sort of talking about Africa as if it was equally patrimonial, equally neo-patrimonial. So they would talk about Zambia under Kaunda in the same way that they would talk about Kenyatta as Kenya, and the same way they would talk about Humphrey Bony's, Cote d'Ivoire. And actually, there's a significant variation in the extent to which the formal rules were followed or not in these countries. And that variation really matters. So one of the things I think that's really important to keep in mind is that in many cases, we see both neo-patrimonial kind of norms or patrimonial sort of practices, as we might think about it, and formal institutions working at the same time. So a really great example of that is the Kenyan case. And I'll just give you a quick example and then I'll pause. In the Kenyan case, we see two trends at the same time. We see repeated holding of elections. We see in 2017, the Supreme Court actually invalidating the president's victory, the first time that had happened in Africa, one of the only times that's happened in the entire world. We also see, as I said, the introduction of that system of devolution, so significant constitutional changes that have actually, seemed to be reasonably robust. And we have presidential term limits being respected. Every president so far has respected term limits, and the signs are that President Kenyatta will stand down ahead of the next election. All of that would speak to us about a process of institutional strengthening and the formal institutions of the state going stronger. But that process has been compatible with an increase or at least continuation of corruption, which seems to be particularly bad at the minute, but has been significant all the way through. Episodes of ethnic violence, most notably in 2007, 2008, but also to some extent around the last elections when there was a lot of tensions and again, considerable violence. And a sort of clientelistic form of politics, which, you could trace in Kenya all the way back to the 50s and 60s. So what we see in Kenya that I think is really interesting is these two trends are actually operating at the same time. It is true that these institutions seem to be becoming stronger and more embedded at the same time as these other factors that in some ways undermine or challenge democratic consolidation are happening. So I think one of the things that we need to be a bit more careful at in different countries is saying, okay, in this particular context, what are the formal institutions and rules that are followed more? What are the ones that are not? Exactly what are these patrimonial practices doing? Exactly what are they undermining? And in some cases, it might be that patrimonialism and institutions are in complete contradiction. The one undermines the other. It might be the case that corruption completely undermines the role of the auditor, for example. But in other cases, they might not be. I mean, in the book, Michaela Kalor has a great chapter which looks at the fact that, politicians who maybe are able to gain wealth and maybe have really strong connections with their constituents, which might often be clientelistic, because they have that strong embedded context locally, might be more willing to resist the dominance of, for example, President Yoweri Museveni than politicians in a sort of less clientelistic system who didn't have that connection to the grassroots, because those people would probably be more beholden to the president and they would have less of a kind of pull on them from ordinary citizens to go off and actually demand change. So I think it's also important not to remember that these types of processes interact in really complicated ways. And it's important not to, always assume that patrimonialism or the strength of some forms of patrimonialism, what is often thought of as being patrimonialism, simply erode or undermine democracy or formal institutions. The final thing then I would say is that, I think in many countries, it's still a really interesting question about which of these different trends, will win out. I mean, is it the case that in Kenya, we'll be talking in 20 years about a country that will still seem to have quite strong institutions in some ways, but will still have all of these patrimonial practices going on underneath at the same time? Or will the institutions win out and they'll crowd out the patrimonial processes and those will slowly die out over the next 20 years? Or, as a pessimist might say, will the kind of corruption and the clientelism simply subsume all of the progress so far when it comes to democracy and the rule of law and suck it down? And I don't think, we actually have a really great answer for that. I think that's one of the really great questions of African studies right now. What is actually going to be the process in countries like Kenya? And in some ways, I think you could add other countries like, Zambia, to the list that, have seen some considerable progress. Zambia, also a country in which, President Chiluba failed to get a third term, but also a country in which we see, problems around corruption and around clientelism and around the personal networks around the president. Again, I think it's a really interesting question to ask, where will Zambia be in 20 years' time? And the final chapter of the book, the conclusion, sets out a kind of framework for thinking through, how we might be able to look at formal institutions and informal or patrimonial practices together to think about, what that's going to do for the long-term future of, various countries in Africa.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. If we are to look at it, we can actually see that there are so many dynamics that are at play in as much as the functioning of democratic institutions in Africa is concerned. And so now, if we are to look at it, let's say, to what extent has foreign intervention affected the credibility and integrity of the functioning of democratic institutions in Africa? And if so, what can African countries do to try and resist this kind of interference?
When you say foreign interference, are you thinking more about the kind of criticism that some would have that, African democracies are dependent on foreign aid, and so interference that kind of operates through the funding of democracy by Western governments? Or are you thinking more about kind of Russian hackers trying to manipulate the American election for Donald Trump? What kind of foreign manipulation are we talking about?
Wonderful. So wonderful. So if we were to look at it, this foreign intervention comes in so many different ways. We do have very big multinational companies that are operating in Africa that to some varying degree sponsor and fund different political party movements in Zimbabwe. We also do have embassies. We also do have international institutions that sort of side with a specific political movement or a specific political ideology so as to advance, let's say, regime change or let's say to support a sitting government?
That is a good question. I think certainly I think there are cases in the past where, Western governments, companies, etc., have overstepped the line in terms of, making it obvious who they would prefer to be in power. And I think there's, also important to keep in mind the role of foreign powers, some of whom do things like, sell arms and weapons to governments, sell censorship and surveillance software to governments and all the rest. And that's clearly for the profit of the country concerned, but it often strengthens the position of authoritarians. So I think, there's a lot of international intervention that isn't good. I think one of the things that's tricky is that, of course, if you are a good authoritarian, and if you know what you're doing as an authoritarian leader or a dictator, you're probably doing 2 or 3 things at the same time that cloud the picture. One of which is that you will characterize, international intervention of almost any kind that isn't directly supportive of you as being, against you. And so, for example, recently in Zimbabwe, we see the Zimbabwean government of Mnangagwa basically following the model of the government of Robert Mugabe and kind of arguing that Western intervention, or support for things like the rule of law, etc., amounts to a kind of attempt to perpetrate regime change and represents an unfair infringement on Zimbabwean sovereignty. And when you get that kind of narrative being pushed, it can be quite hard to work out what's true and what's not. The government would have you believe that the demonstrations in the streets are simply because people are being put up to it by foreign powers. But you speak to ordinary people on the streets and they're pretty sure that the reason they're on the streets is because they can't afford to eat and there's hyperinflation and there's mass corruption and the government has failed on most of its promises. And it's not about foreign powers at all. It's about the failure of the government itself. And so I think we, on the one hand, we want to be critical of the international community and we want to ask them to do better. But on the other hand, we need to be careful not to be kind of sucked into the games that authoritarians play and end up parroting the kind of things that they say as a way of trying to deflect blame from them. So, to take an example from somewhere else in the world, if we look at what's happening in Belarus, President Lukashenko in Belarus is desperate to portray this as a kind of Western intervention to unseat him, because then he can go to Vladimir Putin in Russia and ask him to support him against this unfair Western intervention. But if you talk to people on the streets in Belarus, it's fairly clear that this is a domestic movement that has domestic sources and is domestic-led and simply wants better government. And I think that's probably true of a lot of African countries right now, where we see really big opposition protests and movements, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and so on. So I think it does then become very, very problematic and very challenging. What role should the international community play? You know, it's interesting to me that on the one hand, some people, if you were to just take social media as an example, will be highly critical and will suggest that the international community should pull out and get their noses out of other people's business, you know, which is not an unfair position. But other people will say the international community actually, you know, it should be criticized for not doing more, for not removing somebody like Mnangagwa or Mugabe from power, for not doing more to fund democratic movements, because you know, this is what should be done. And if you talk to civil society and opposition parties in many countries, they would prefer, you know, Western donors to do much more rather than what's less. And so I think, you know, it does then become sort of really a question of who gets to speak for the country. Is it the government? Is it the opposition? Is it the civil society? Is it the people on the streets? All of them perhaps want slightly different relationships with the international community and see, you know, the international intervention in different ways. But I agree with your, you know, your suggestion at the beginning in the way you phrased the question, which is that the more the international community as a whole can be seen to be consistent, honest, and neutral in terms of applying principles rather than supporting sides, the stronger it will be able to be in terms of, you know, supporting these things over time. And I think one of the biggest challenges for us right now, I say us being people in the international community who are interested in these things, is that, you know, if you look at what's happening in the UK with Brexit, if you look at what's happening in the United States with Black Lives Matter, if you look at Donald Trump's suggestions that he might not accept electoral defeat in the next US election, a lot of the signals that are being sent is that the people who've been talking about democracy for a long time didn't really mean it. They were promoting it abroad while not really taking care of it at home. And of course, it's particularly telling that that is happening at the same time as complaints, completely valid complaints about racial inequality and the horrendous treatment of Black people and other minorities by the police force, particularly in the United States, but not just in the United States. It's also a problem in the UK. And that kind of double standard, you know, the perception that people are coming and lecturing abroad, whereas they are not actually delivering what they're talking about at home. I think that is also a big challenge for people who want to support rule of law and democracy around the world. So one of the things, you know, one of the other books that came out around the same time as the one we're talking about today was called How to Rig an Election, which I wrote with Brian Klaas. And in that book, you know, one of the things we argue for is that if Western actors, international actors, the traditional democracy promotion organizations want to do a really great job of promoting democracy around the world in the next 10 years, one of the things they need to do is to be more humble, to recognize that they don't always get it right at home, to recognize that you can't preach abroad if you have challenges in your domestic situation, and therefore to present this as more of a partnership. We all have problems with our democracy, some more severe, some less severe. Most of us have problems when it comes to inequality, both economic and racial. And those challenges need to be addressed across the board, not just in Africa. They need to be addressed just as much in the United States and the UK. And a better approach to do that would be to form a partnership. So not say we're going to come and lecture you about what you need to do, but rather to say let's all get together in a common conversation and put all of our democratic weaknesses on the table and talk about how we can all help each other. Because it may well turn out to be the case that when it comes to election observation, race relations, building societies after conflict, for example, Africa has far more to teach the United States than the United States has to teach Africa. And I think if we were able to start to form a better partnership like that, if we saw the international community, you know, the Western community being more humble, it might then start to ease some of those questions of legitimacy when it comes to the support of democracy.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. So if we are to look at it based on what you have just immediately said, if we are to look at it, we can actually see that many of these developing countries have, to some varying degree, adopted what we can call or term a political thought or a political democratic thought as a political system. And some countries have been successful and some countries have not. But generally, do you think that the success of and the efficiency of democratic institutions strongly depends on the political culture of a given country?
I'm often a bit scared of the term political culture because I think it is one of those terms that can become, over homogenized. A country has a political culture when in reality it probably has multiple overlapping cultures. One of the things that my research sort of has shown is that we can say support for democracy or support for the government, say in a country is 68%, fine. But if you actually break it down, it's really different in different towns and villages. It's really different in urban areas to rural areas. It's often really different in the capital city to other urban areas. And so I'm slightly wary of the culture argument. I also think it slightly depends what we mean by culture in this context. I mean, the Afrobarometer survey, which is great. If anyone out there hasn't been to the Afrobarometer website, go there now. You can do online data analysis for free using their wonderful survey data. The Afrobarometer survey tells us that in pretty much every African country, the vast majority of people, or at least a strong majority of people, want to live in a democracy, believe in elections, and believe in multi-party politics. They also believe, in most countries, in what I've called a kind of consensual form of politics. They want competitive elections, but they don't want, in general, opposition parties to contest the results in the streets. They want to see, democracy, but they don't necessarily want to see the opposition arguing every single point with the government. At least this is what you get if you look at the survey responses. So, when people say to me, is the problem culture? I say, well, what do you mean? Actually, we see reasonably strong and robust support for democracy, at least in public opinion surveys, pretty much across the continent. And it's not just that people say they support democracy and they don't know what it means, which is what someone said to me in Nairobi when I was giving a talk about this, a middle-class Kenyan who was a bit suspicious of whether his rural compatriots would be able to understand what democracy meant. If we actually ask other questions that are really specific about specific institutions, like support for presidential term limits and a 2-term limit, that's really high. Many countries, 80–90% of some people support a presidential term limit. So I'm not so sure that the problem is cultural in a sort of simple way. I think that the vast majority of citizens do want to live in multi-party democracies. They don't have a hankering for military rule. There's very little support for one-person or dictatorships. There's a little bit more support for the one-party state, but still very low. So there is not a kind of desire amongst African populations to live under a kind of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian model. In general, the aspiration is to live under a democracy. I think the question for many people is, how do you get to a democracy? And is it safe to invest and to vote for that right now? So, just to give you an example, I think that there are quite a few people out there who feel to some extent that they're trapped in a kind of prisoner's dilemma, or maybe not a prisoner's dilemma, but a kind of, a challenging dilemma in which they maybe don't want to vote ethnically. They maybe don't want to vote clientelistically, but they don't quite have the confidence in the system to deliver fair outcomes. And they worry that if they don't do this and everybody else does, they lose out. And so, I've got lots of middle-class friends across the continent who will tell me, I don't want to vote for him. I know he was corrupt. I know he was responsible for that. I know he was involved in the gangs over there. I don't want to vote for him. But I worry that if I don't vote for him and no one else does, these other guys get in and they're going to take the resources and distribute them to another part of the country and we're going to lose out. So maybe I have to vote for this guy even though I don't want to. So I guess what I would say is I don't think the fundamental problem is a kind of that Africa doesn't have democratic culture or that Africans don't believe in democracy. I think it's that there's a series of challenges. Some of them are institutional, some of them are about trust, some of them are about education and income that Africa is sort of facing. And when we get over those challenges, and I believe, that if we have, for example, reasonably high levels of economic growth in many countries, that, the growth of the middle class, the expansion of education will help with that process. It won't solve that process itself, but it will facilitate that. That actually the belief of most African, societies that it's a good thing to be able to choose your own leader, that, being able to express an opinion is important, and your ability to speak within the community is important, will come to the fore. And we won't talk much about this. And I think that the final thing I would say is that, one of the things that I sort of worry about is the idea that Africa is not democratic, or that African societies are not democratic, or that African people don't understand democracy. It's kind of been weaponized by political leaders. One of the things that an authoritarian leader will tell you is that their people do not want democracy. They'd rather have potatoes than the vote. And that their people don't, really necessarily understand democracy, or it's not an African system, it's a foreign system, it was imposed by the West, and so on and so on. And I think a lot of the time that's basically a manipulation of, there's an interesting argument in there, there's a position in there that has received some scholarly attention and is worth talking about, but that is being manipulated and weaponized to justify authoritarian rule and to justify preventing people from actually being able to select their leaders. And actually, every time we've really been able to go in and ask people in surveys, people have said, actually, I want the right to select my leader, please. And interestingly, in the Afrobarometer, there's very little evidence that people really want to trade democracy off at its core value for, a little bit more money. So my sense is that support for democracy is reasonably healthy, but we shouldn't take it for granted. Right? It can't be taken for granted. It's not an inherent feature of any society, as we see around the world when democracy fails to perform, when elections are seen to be rigged, when the economy tanks, people's support for democracy and willingness to support support for democracy goes down, willingness to support extreme alternatives goes up. And that will be similar in Africa to what it is everywhere else. So I wouldn't say for me the problem is culture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Cheeseman, for your participation. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics to discuss their latest and outstanding publications for the purposes of teaching and learning, and for the purposes of conscientizing the ordinary person. Thank you very much for your participation, and have a good day.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.